The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocer's bill and a notice from the Parish Poor Fund. Adelaide knew who it was from before she even broke the seal. The heavy cream paper, the red wax pressed with the Harding family crest, a crest that had once belonged to her husband's side of the family before his brother claimed everything worth claiming. She unfolded the letter beside the cold hearth of her small cottage on Avon Street, where the morning light came through a window with a crack running through the bottom pane. The fire had gone out during the night, and she hadn't lit a new one. Coal cost money, and money was something Adelaide counted by the shilling these days. The letter read, "Dear Sister, you are warmly invited to our annual summer garden party at Harding Park on the 6th of June. The occasion shall be one of great splendor, with guests arriving from across the county. I do hope you will attend, as family ought to be present at such gatherings.
I must ask, however, that you dress simply. My daughters, Louisa and Charlotte, have commissioned new silk gowns from London for the event, and I should not wish for any confusion among the guests regarding who is the host family and who is otherwise. Your devoted brother-in-law, Lord Marcus Harding." Adelaide read the last line twice, then a third time. "I should not wish for any confusion among the guests regarding who is the host family and who is otherwise. Otherwise." That single word sat on the page like a bruise. Marcus hadn't even bothered to dress his cruelty in proper language. He wanted her there so his guests could see the poor relation, the widow in her faded mourning dress standing next to his daughters in their London silks. A living display of what happened to a woman who married for love instead of fortune. Adelaide folded the letter and placed it on the mantel beside a small brass clock that no longer kept time. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden shelf and breathed. 2 years. It had been 2 years since Thomas died. 2 years since the physicians shook their heads and the fever took the kindest man she had ever known. And in those 2 years, Marcus had done everything in his power to remind Adelaide exactly where she stood, which was nowhere. Thomas had been a brilliant man, an inventor, a tinkerer, who spent his evenings drawing mechanical designs by candlelight while Adelaide read aloud to him from borrowed books. He had spent the last 3 years of his life perfecting a mechanical loom that could double the output of a cotton mill without adding a single worker to the floor. He had filled leather journals with calculations, sketches, and engineering notes. He had built a working model in their garden shed. And then he had died. Within a month of the funeral, Marcus had swept into their cottage with a solicitor and 2 crates. He told Adelaide he was collecting Thomas's personal effects for safekeeping. She had been too deep in grief to question it, too trusting of family to suspect anything. Now, Thomas's loom was registered under Marcus's name at the Crown Patent Office. Marcus collected factory royalties from 3 cotton mills in the north. He had built a new wing on his estate with the profits. And Adelaide lived on a pension of £40 a year, mending her own stockings. She had suspected for months that something was wrong about the patent. Thomas had never mentioned Marcus as a partner in his work. But suspicion without proof was just bitterness, and Adelaide refused to become a bitter woman. A knock came at her front door. Adelaide straightened her dress, a grey wool that had been re-hemmed twice, and crossed the narrow hallway. When she opened the door, the man standing on her step was the last person she expected to see at a cottage on Avon Street. He was tall, dark-haired, and dressed in a beautifully tailored navy coat with brass buttons that caught the morning sun. His boots were polished, his cravat perfectly tied, and a gold watch chain hung from his waistcoat pocket. Behind him, a glossy black carriage with a gilded crest stood waiting on the street, its matched pair of grey horses drawing curious looks from the neighbors. "Mrs. Adelaide Harding?" the man asked.
"Yes."
"My name is Victor Ashworth, Duke of Ravenhurst." He removed his hat. "I wonder if I might have a word with you. It concerns your late husband's work." Adelaide stared at him. A duke, standing on her front step, asking about Thomas. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Grace," she said carefully.
"May I come inside? What I have to say is rather delicate, and I would prefer your neighbors did not hear it."
Adelaide hesitated. Then she stepped aside. The Duke had to duck slightly through her doorway.
He glanced around the small sitting room, the threadbare armchair, the empty coal box, the single shelf of books, and his expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes that might have been anger, though it clearly wasn't directed at her. "Mrs. Harding, I own ironworks in Shropshire. I also invest in textile manufacturing across the Midlands. As part of my business, I regularly review new patents filed with the Crown Office." He paused. 3 weeks ago, I examined a patent registered under the name of Lord Marcus Harding for a mechanical loom design. The engineering formulas in that filing are extraordinary. Truly remarkable work. Adelaide said nothing. "But here is the trouble," the Duke continued. "I had the pleasure of attending a lecture at the Royal Institution 4 years ago. A lecture given by a man named Thomas Harding, your husband, in which he presented the exact same mechanical principles. I took notes during that lecture. I still have them." Adelaide's hands went still in her lap. "Mrs. Harding, the patent your brother-in-law filed is your husband's invention. Every formula, every ratio, every gear specification, it matches Thomas's lecture to the letter. Lord Marcus did not invent that loom. He stole it." The room went very quiet. The cracked window let in a thin draft that moved the curtain. Adelaide looked at the letter on the mantel. Then she looked at the Duke. "I know," she said softly. "I have always known. I simply had no way to prove it." Duke Victor reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "You do now. And if you will allow me, Mrs. Harding, I intend to help you take back everything that was taken from you." Adelaide looked at the document in his hand. Then she looked at Marcus's letter on the mantel, the one asking her to dress simply so she wouldn't outshine his daughters. She picked up the letter, folded it once, and placed it inside her dress pocket. "When do we begin?" she asked. The carriage ride from Bath to Shropshire took the better part of 5 hours. Adelaide spent the first hour in silence, watching the Somerset hills give way to the flat green pastures of Gloucestershire. She had not traveled this far from home since Thomas's funeral, and the world beyond her cottage window felt both familiar and strange, like a language she once spoke fluently but had started to forget. Duke Victor sat across from her, reviewing a stack of papers he had brought in a leather folio. He did not press her to speak, which she appreciated. Most men of his standing would have filled the silence with their own voice, simply because they could. Victor seemed comfortable letting the quiet do its work. Somewhere past Gloucester, Adelaide finally spoke. "Your Grace, I must ask you something plainly." He looked up from his papers. "Please, why are you helping me? You are a duke with ironworks and textile investments. You could simply file your own challenge against Marcus's patent on commercial grounds and cut me out entirely. You do not need a penniless widow complicating your legal strategy." Victor folded his papers and set them aside. "You are correct. I could challenge the patent myself and likely win, but winning a commercial dispute would only transfer the rights to me or void the patent altogether. It would not return what belongs to you. And that matters to you." "It does." "Why?" He considered the question for a moment. "Because I sat in that lecture hall 4 years ago and watched your husband explain his work. He spoke about that loom the way most men speak about their children. Every gear, every tension ratio, every thread count, he had thought about it all with such care. And when he finished, he told the audience that his greatest hope was that the design would reduce the working hours of mill laborers without cutting their wages." Victor paused. I have met a great many inventors in my line of work, Mrs. Harding. Most of them think about profit. Your husband thought about people. A man like that deserves to have his name on his own invention. Adelaide turned her face toward the window so he would not see her eyes. They arrived at Ironbridge as the afternoon sun sat heavy and golden over the River Severn. The foundry was enormous, a long stone building with tall chimneys releasing pale smoke into the sky. Workers in leather aprons moved between furnaces and casting floors, and the air carried the warm smell of heated iron and coal dust. Victor led Adelaide through a side entrance into a private workshop separated from the main foundry floor. The room was filled with mechanical models, half-built engines, gear assemblies mounted on wooden frames, and a long workbench covered in technical drawings held flat by iron weights. In the center of the room stood a wooden-framed loom prototype, about half the size of a full mill machine. Adelaide recognized the basic structure immediately. It was modeled after Thomas's design, though something about the shuttle mechanism looked different. I commissioned this based on the patent drawings Marcus filed, Victor explained. My engineers have been trying to build a working version for 2 months. The design is brilliant on paper, but we cannot get the tension assembly to hold under speed. The shuttle jams after every 6th pass. Adelaide walked slowly around the prototype, her fingers tracing the frame without quite touching it. She studied the shuttle rail, the bobbin housing, the reed mechanism. Then she crouched beside the lower frame and examined the gear train that drove the shuttle arm.
May I see the patent drawings?
She asked. Victor handed her a rolled set of papers from the workbench. Adelaide unrolled them and studied the gear specifications for a long moment. Then she set them down and looked at the prototype again. The problem is here, she said, pointing to a small brass gear connected to the shuttle drive.
This gear ratio is wrong. Thomas's original design used a 42-tooth wheel on the primary drive and a 28-tooth wheel on the secondary. Marcus filed it as 42 and 32.
Victor frowned. That is a small difference.
Small enough to look like a copying error, large enough to destroy the timing. The shuttle needs to complete its pass before the reed beats the weft into place. With a 32-tooth secondary, the shuttle arrives a fraction late. The thread bunches, the tension fails, and the mechanism locks. Adelaide straightened up. Marcus changed the ratio because he did not understand what it did. He copied the rest accurately enough.
But this one detail escaped him, because Thomas never wrote down the reasoning. He kept it in his head. Victor stared at her.
You know this from memory? I know this because I sat beside my husband every evening for 3 years while he built the original. I held the candle while he filed those gears by hand. I read his calculations aloud to him while he tested every ratio from 20 to 50.
Adelaide met the Duke's gaze steadily.
Thomas talked to me about his work, Your Grace. He explained every piece of it. He believed I was clever enough to understand. And he was right.
Victor said nothing for a moment. Then he walked to the workbench, selected a brass gear from a wooden tray, and held it up.
42 and 28. Can you show my engineers?
I can. For the next hour, Adelaide worked alongside Victor's 2 senior engineers, a pair of quiet, serious men named Caldwell and Briggs. She guided them through the gear replacement, corrected the shuttle rail alignment, and adjusted the bobbin tension using a method Thomas had developed by watching spinners work at a village market. When they finished, Caldwell pulled the drive lever. The shuttle flew across the frame in a clean, smooth pass. The reed fell perfectly into position, the thread held taut and even. Caldwell pulled the lever again, and again. 6 passes. 10. 20. The machine ran without a single jam. Briggs looked at Victor with wide eyes. Victor looked at Adelaide. Mrs. Harding, he said quietly, I will back you legally and financially to reclaim this patent. Every resource I have is at your disposal. But we need one thing to make this case stand in court."
"The originals," Adelaide said. "Thomas's journal, his dated sketches, his handwritten notes with timestamps proving he completed the design before Marcus ever filed."
"Yes, and I believe Marcus has them locked away somewhere in his estate. Without those documents, we have my lecture notes and the parish records, which are helpful, but a good solicitor could argue they only prove Thomas had an idea, not a finished invention. The journal and the blueprints are the proof that ends the argument."
Adelaide looked at the loom prototype, still running smoothly on the workbench. Thomas's machine. Thomas's brilliance. Locked inside another man's name. "Then we find them," she said. They left Ironbridge before dawn.
The roads were still damp from overnight rain, and the carriage wheels cut soft tracks through the mud as they wound south through the Shropshire countryside toward the Wiltshire border. Adelaide had barely slept. Victor had arranged a room for her at a respectable inn near the foundry, but she had spent most of the night sitting at the small writing desk, turning Thomas's memory over in her hands like a stone she had carried for too long. She kept thinking about the gears. 42 and 28. Such a small detail. Such a simple thing to know. And yet that small thing had proven something enormous. That Marcus had copied what he did not understand, and Adelaide understood what he could never copy. The Black Swan was a handsome coaching inn set back from the main road between Chippenham and Devizes. It had a stone front covered in climbing ivy, a stable yard busy with horses being changed for the London mail coach, and a reputation among the gentry as a place where discreet meetings could happen without drawing attention. Victor had chosen it deliberately. It sat almost exactly between Bath and Marcus's estate at Oakhaven, which meant neither Adelaide nor their guest would need to travel through the other's territory to reach it. Their guest was already waiting when they arrived. He was seated in a private dining parlor at the rear of the inn, a small room with dark paneling and a single window overlooking the kitchen garden. His name was Mr. Phelps. He was perhaps 60, gray-haired, thin in the way men become thin when they have spent decades standing at attention. His coat was clean but worn at the elbows, and his hands rested flat on the table as though he was accustomed to keeping them still and visible at all times. He stood when Adelaide entered and gave a formal bow. "Mrs. Harding, it has been some time."
"Mr. Phelps,"
Adelaide extended her hand.
"I remember you well. You served at Harding Park for many years."
23 years, madam. I began as a footman under your husband's father and rose to butler under Lord Marcus." His mouth tightened. "I was dismissed 14 months ago, without a character reference, without the final quarter's wages owed to me." Victor closed the parlor door and gestured for everyone to sit. A pot of tea and 3 cups had been laid on the table. Victor poured while Adelaide studied Mr. Phelps across the table.
"May I ask why you were dismissed?"
Adelaide said. Phelps hesitated. He glanced at Victor, who gave a small nod. "I asked a question I should not have asked," Phelps said. "Or rather, I asked it of the wrong person."
"What question?"
Lord Marcus had instructed me to arrange the transfer of certain items from the East Wing attic to a solicitor's office in Salisbury. A locked iron trunk. Heavy. It took 2 footmen to carry it down the stairs. I was told to arrange a cart and driver and to ensure the trunk reached the solicitor before the end of the week. Phelps paused and folded his hands. I had worked in that house long enough to know what was in the East Wing attic. The late Mr. Thomas Harding's personal papers had been stored there since Lord Marcus collected them from your cottage, madam. Journals, drawings, correspondence, all of it packed into that trunk and locked with a key Lord Marcus kept on his own chain. Adelaide felt her chest tighten.
"Go on."
"The night before the trunk was to be moved, I overheard Lord Marcus speaking with his solicitor in the study. I was passing through the corridor and the door was ajar. I heard Lord Marcus say, and I remember the words clearly. Once the patent is registered, destroy the originals. I want no trace of Thomas's handwriting connected to this design.
The room went silent. Adelaide's teacup sat untouched before her.
I stopped the transfer the following morning, Phelps continued. I told Lord Marcus the cart driver had fallen ill, and the journey would need to be postponed by a day. Then I went to Lord Marcus privately and told him that I believed Mr. Thomas Harding's personal papers ought to be offered to his widow before being sent to any solicitor. I told him it was the decent thing to do.
And he dismissed you for that, Victor said.
Within the hour. He called me disloyal. He said I had overstepped my position and that a servant's duty was to carry out instructions, not to have opinions about them. Phelps's voice remained steady, but his jaw was tight. 23 years of service. Gone before luncheon. Adelaide reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Phelps's.
I am sorry, Mr. Phelps, truly.
He gave a small, dignified nod. I did not come here for sympathy, madam. I came because what Lord Marcus did to your husband's memory was wrong, and what he did to you was worse. Victor leaned forward. Mr. Phelps, the trunk. Was it ever moved to the solicitor? That is the fortunate part, Your Grace. After my dismissal, Lord Marcus replaced me with a younger man, a man less experienced, less curious, and far less likely to ask uncomfortable questions, but also a man who did not know the East Wing attic existed. The house is large. The attic is accessed through a servant's staircase behind the linen closets on the second floor. If you did not already know it was there, you would walk past the door 100 times without ever noticing it. So the trunk is still there, Adelaide said. I believe so. Lord Marcus intended to have it moved and destroyed, but my dismissal disrupted his schedule, and as far as I have been able to learn from former colleagues still in the household, the trunk has remained in the attic untouched since that day. Victor exchanged a glance with Adelaide. Is the trunk still locked? Phelps reached into his coat pocket and produced a small iron key, darkened with age. He placed it on the table between them. When I was butler, I kept duplicate keys to every lock in the house. It was part of my duty. Lord Marcus never thought to ask for them when he turned me out. This opens the iron trunk in the East Wing attic.
Adelaide stared at the key. It was small and plain, the kind of key that could open a garden shed or a writing desk. And yet, it might unlock everything Marcus had stolen.
There is one more thing, Phelps added. Lord Marcus's garden party is in 4 days. The household will be in chaos preparing for it. Extra staff hired from the village, deliveries arriving at all hours, rooms being aired and dressed. If someone were to visit the house during that time, perhaps under the pretense of returning a family heirloom or delivering a gift, the East Wing would be completely unattended. Every servant will be downstairs or on the lawns.
Victor looked at Adelaide. She picked up the iron key and closed her fingers around it. 4 days, she said quietly.
Phelps finished his tea, stood, and buttoned his coat. I wish you every success, Mrs. Harding. Your husband was a good man. He deserved far better than what his brother gave him. He bowed once to Adelaide, once to Victor, and left through the inn's rear door without looking back. Adelaide sat holding the key in her palm, feeling the cold weight of it against her skin. 4 days. 4 days to take back what Marcus had stolen. 4 days to give Thomas his name again. She slipped the key into her dress pocket, right beside Marcus's letter. It felt like they belonged together. The village of Oakhaven sat in a shallow valley surrounded by sheep pastures and old oak woodland. It was the kind of place that had not changed much in 100 years and seemed content about it. Stone cottages lined the single main road. A blacksmith's forge stood at one end, a draper's shop at the other, and the church of St. Michael's rose from the center of the village like a gray stone anchor holding everything in place. Adelaide had not visited Oakhaven since Thomas's funeral. The last time she had walked this road, The hedgerows had been bare, and the sky had been the color of wet slate. Now the hedges were thick with dog roses and elderflower, and the afternoon sun turned the church tower gold. The village looked the same. Adelaide did not. Victor's carriage drew up beside the lich gate, and they stepped out into the warm air. A few villagers glanced their way. A duke's carriage was difficult to ignore in a place like Oakhaven, but no one approached. "Thomas worked here?" Victor asked as they walked through the churchyard. "For nearly a year. The parish vestry had a large table and good light from the south window. The vicar at the time, Reverend Aldridge, offered Thomas the use of the room on days when the church wardens were not meeting. Thomas would ride out from Bath twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and spend the whole day working on his drawings."
"Why not work at home?"
Adelaide smiled slightly. "Our cottage was small, Your Grace. One room served as parlor, dining room, and study. Thomas needed space to lay out his full-scale drawings. Some of them were 6 feet wide. The vestry table was the only surface large enough. And Thomas liked the quiet. He said the church helped him think." They reached the arched doorway of St. Michael's. The door was open, and the interior smelled of old wood and candle wax. A man in a dark clerical coat was arranging hymn books on the front pew. He turned at the sound of footsteps and peered down the nave. "May I help you?" he called.
"Reverend Aldridge,"
Adelaide said. The vicar came closer, squinting in the dim light. He was older than Adelaide remembered. His hair had gone fully white and his shoulders had rounded, but his eyes were still sharp and kind. "Good heavens," he said softly. "Adelaide Harding, my dear girl."
"It has been too long, Reverend."
"Far too long." He took both her hands in his. "I think of Thomas often, you know. Such a fine mind, such a good heart." He glanced past her at Victor and straightened. "And you are, forgive me, sir." "Duke Victor of Ravenhurst," Victor said, removing his hat. The vicar's eyebrows rose considerably, but he recovered well. "Your Grace, welcome to St. Michael's. How may I be of service?" Adelaide looked at Victor, and he gave her a slight nod. This was her story to tell. "Reverend, I need to ask you about something from 5 years ago. When Thomas was using the vestry to work on his loom design, do you recall him completing the prototype, the final version?" Aldridge thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I do, yes. He came to me one afternoon in quite a state of excitement. He said the design was finished, truly finished, and that he wanted someone to witness the completion for his own records. He was very particular about that. He wanted a date, a signature, and a formal entry." "An entry where?" "In the vestry logbook. Come, I will show you." He led them through a side door into the vestry, a square room with whitewashed walls, a heavy oak table, and a tall bookcase filled with parish records going back decades. Aldridge ran his finger along the spines until he found a thick cloth-bound volume with the years 1810 to 1815 stamped in faded gold on the cover. He lifted it out carefully and set it on the table. "I have kept every logbook since I took this living 30 years ago," he said, turning the pages with practiced care. "Church wardens' meetings, burial fees, charity disbursements, visiting clergy, everything passes through this book." He stopped at a page roughly 2/3 of the way through. Adelaide leaned forward. There, in neat brown ink, was an entry dated the 14th of March, 1813. "This day, Mr. Thomas Harding of Bath did present to me a completed mechanical drawing and working specification for a device he terms a balanced tension loom, designed for the improvement of cotton weaving. Mr. Harding states this work has been conducted over a period of 3 years and represents his sole invention. I have examined the drawings and attest that Mr. Harding demonstrated the device's operation to my satisfaction using a wooden scale model brought to the vestry for this purpose. This entry is made at Mr. Harding's request as a witnessed record of completion. Signed, Reverend Edmund Aldridge, Vicar of St. Michael's, Oakhaven. Witnessed, Mrs. Mary Trent, Church Warden. Adelaide read the entry twice. Her finger hovered just above the page, tracing the lines without touching them. Thomas's name, his invention, his words, recorded in someone else's hand, but carrying his voice so clearly she could almost hear him standing in this room, explaining his work with that quiet pride he always carried.
Reverend, Victor said, the patent currently registered with the Crown for this loom design is filed under the name Lord Marcus Harding. The filing date is September 1815, 2.5 years after this entry. Aldridge stared at him. That cannot be right. Thomas told me his brother had contributed some money toward materials, but the design was entirely his own. He was very clear about that. I would not have written sole invention otherwise. It is precisely right, Victor said, and this entry is proof of it. Could you make a certified copy of this page for us, Reverend? Adelaide asked. In your own hand, with your seal and signature? I will do it this very hour. Aldridge looked at Adelaide with a kind of fierce tenderness. Thomas was a good man, Adelaide. One of the best I have ever known in this parish. If his brother has done what you say he has done, then I consider it my Christian duty to help you set it right. He sat down at the table, drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and began copying the entry in his careful clerical hand. Adelaide watched him write, each word landing on the page like a brick being laid into a wall that was slowly, steadily closing around Marcus. Victor stood beside the bookcase, his arms folded, watching Adelaide's face. She looked different from the woman who had opened her cottage door yesterday morning. Something had shifted. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it had company now. Purpose had moved in beside it, and purpose had sharper edges. When Aldridge finished, he blotted the copy, pressed his parish seal into a circle of red wax at the bottom, and handed it to Adelaide. Guard this well, he said. Adelaide folded the document and placed it inside her traveling case, beside the iron key from Phelps and the letter from Marcus. 3 items, 3 pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to look like something Marcus would not be able to talk his way out of. They thanked the vicar and walked back through the churchyard toward the carriage. The sun was lower now, throwing long shadows across the old gravestones. Adelaide paused at the lich gate and looked back at the church. Thomas chose this place for a reason, she said quietly. He could have worked anywhere. He chose a church. He wanted a man of God to see what he had built. He wanted it recorded honestly. Victor opened the carriage door for her. And now it will be. Adelaide climbed inside and sat with her hands folded in her lap. Through the window, she could see Marcus's estate on the hill beyond the village. The tall chimneys, the new east wing built with stolen money, the grounds already being prepared for the garden party. 3 more days. Adelaide arrived at Harding Park alone. Victor had argued against it. He wanted to accompany her, or at the very least send one of his men to wait nearby in case something went wrong. But Adelaide had been firm. A duke's carriage parked outside Marcus's estate 3 days before the garden party would raise every alarm in the house. Adelaide arriving by hired coach with a small parcel wrapped in cloth. That was just a widow returning family keepsakes. Ordinary, forgettable. She had dressed carefully that morning. A plain brown traveling dress with a high collar, a bonnet that sat low on her forehead, sensible boots. She looked exactly like what Marcus expected her to be. Modest, quiet, and small. Today she wanted that. The parcel she carried contained a set of embroidered handkerchiefs that had belonged to Thomas's mother. They were genuinely beautiful, stitched with forget-me-nots in pale blue thread,
and they were genuinely Adelaide's to return. She had chosen them because they were real. A convincing lie, she had learned from Thomas, worked best when it was built around something true. The coach left her at the front gate just past noon. The estate was already in the early stages of preparation for the party. 2 groundsmen were stringing lantern poles along the main drive. A cart, loaded with folding chairs, stood outside the stable yard. A boy was sweeping the front steps, while a maid beat dust from a set of curtains draped over the terrace railing. Adelaide walked up the drive with the parcel under her arm and knocked at the front door. The housekeeper answered. She was a stout woman in a starched cap, whom Adelaide did not recognize, a new hire since Phelps's dismissal, just as the former butler had predicted. She looked at Adelaide with the polite blankness of someone who had never seen her before.
Good afternoon. My name is Mrs. Adelaide Harding. I am Lord Marcus's sister-in-law. I have come to return a set of family items ahead of the garden party.
The housekeeper glanced at the parcel.
Lord Marcus is not at home, madam. He is down at the South Meadow overseeing the marquee.
That is perfectly all right. I do not wish to disturb him. I simply wanted to leave these with the household. They belonged to the late Mrs. Harding, his mother. I thought the family might like to have them back. The housekeeper softened slightly. That is very kind, madam. Would you like to come inside? I can have tea brought to the morning room while I find a proper place for them. Thank you, yes, that would be lovely. Adelaide followed the housekeeper through the entrance hall. The house looked much as she remembered. Dark oak paneling, a wide staircase with a carved banister, portraits of Harding ancestors lining the walls. Marcus had added new furnishings since her last visit. A large gilded mirror in the hallway. A marble-topped console table that looked French. All paid for, Adelaide thought, with money earned from Thomas's mind. The housekeeper led her to the morning room and left to arrange tea. Adelaide sat in a chair by the window and waited. Through the glass, she could see Marcus's figure in the distance, standing among a group of workers beside a half-erected canvas tent. He was pointing and gesturing, clearly absorbed in the arrangements. Good. Adelaide counted to 60. Then she stood, crossed the morning room, and opened the door into the corridor. The house was loud with preparation. Somewhere down the passage toward the kitchens, she could hear the cook shouting about a delivery of game birds. A maid hurried past, carrying an armful of pressed tablecloths without glancing at Adelaide. Another was polishing candlesticks in the dining room with the door wide open, her back turned. Adelaide moved through the ground-floor corridor toward the main staircase. She climbed to the first landing and turned left, away from the family bedrooms, toward the east wing. The noise from downstairs faded with each step. By the time she reached the linen closets at the far end of the second-floor passage, the house around her was perfectly still. Phelps had described the entrance exactly. Between the second and third linen closets, set into the wall at an angle that made it look like part of the paneling, was a narrow door with a plain brass handle. No lock on the outside, no marking. Just a door that looked like it led to a shallow cupboard. Adelaide opened it. Behind it, a steep servant's staircase rose into darkness. She gathered her skirt and climbed. The steps were bare wood, dusty and cold under her boots. The air smelled of old wool and dry timber. At the top, another door, this one heavier, with an iron latch that stuck for a moment before giving way. The attic was long and low-ceilinged, running the full length of the east wing. Pale light came through 2 small dormer windows caked with grime. The space was filled with the kind of things wealthy families stored and forgot. Rolled carpets standing upright like columns, stacked wooden crates, a broken rocking horse with one glass eye, trunks of old clothing, a dismantled bed frame leaning against the wall. And there, beneath the far window, exactly where Phelps had said it would be, stood the iron trunk. It was black, about 3 feet long and 2 feet deep, with brass corner fittings gone green with age. A heavy padlock hung from the front clasp. Adelaide knelt beside it,
reached into her dress pocket, and drew out the iron key. Her hands were steady. She had expected them to shake, but they did not. Something about being this close to Thomas's things made her calm rather than nervous. She was not stealing. She was collecting what belonged to her. The key turned smoothly.
The padlock opened with a soft click. Adelaide lifted the lid. Inside, packed in careful layers, was everything Marcus had taken from her cottage 2 years ago. Thomas's leather-bound journal, thick with entries and calculations. A rolled set of linen blueprints tied with string. A bundle of letters in Thomas's handwriting. A small wooden box containing his measuring instruments. Calipers, a brass rule, a set of drawing compasses. Adelaide opened the journal first. The front page, in Thomas's neat hand, read, Journal of Mechanical Designs, T. Harding, Bath, 1810. She turned to the final entry, dated the 12th of March, 1813, 2 days before the vestry logbook entry. Thomas had written, Design complete, all calculations verified, working model tested at vestry, full function achieved. Tomorrow I shall ask Reverend Aldridge to witness and record the completion. This machine is my life's work, and I want it remembered properly. Adelaide closed the journal and held it against her chest. For a long moment, she stayed there on her knees in the dusty attic, holding her husband's words to her heart. Then she stood. She tucked the journal and the rolled blueprints inside the deep inner lining of her traveling cloak, secured them flat against her body with the cloak's ties, and closed the trunk. She replaced the padlock and locked it. Everything else she left exactly as it was. Marcus would not open this trunk again any time soon, and by the time he did, it would no longer matter. She descended the staircase, closed the hidden door behind her, and walked back along the second-floor passage. As she turned the corner toward the main staircase, the housekeeper appeared at the bottom of the steps, carrying a tea tray.
There you are, madame. I was just bringing your tea. Did you lose your way?
Adelaide smiled.
I did, I'm afraid. This house is larger than I remembered. I was looking for the ladies' retiring room.
Just down the hall to the right, madame. Shall I wait for you in the morning room?
Actually, I think I must be going. I have a long journey back to Bath, and I should not like to travel after dark. Please give Lord Marcus my regards, and tell him I look forward to seeing him at the party.
The housekeeper saw her to the door. Adelaide walked down the front drive, past the groundsman, past the lantern poles, past the cart of folding chairs, and climbed into the hired coach waiting at the gate. She did not look back at the house. She did not need to. Thomas's journal pressed warm and solid against her ribs as the coach pulled away. They rode for Bristol before the sun had fully cleared the hills east of Bath. Victor had sent a letter ahead by express rider the previous evening, requesting a formal appointment with the chief patent registrar. The letter bore the Ravenhurst seal, which tended to open doors that would otherwise remain firmly closed to a widow traveling alone. Adelaide did not enjoy relying on another person's title to be heard, but she was practical enough to accept it. The world worked the way it worked. She could resent the rules, or she could use them. Today, she chose to use them. Bristol was loud and alive when they arrived. The harbor was thick with merchant vessels unloading cargo, barrels of sugar from the West Indies, bolts of cotton from India, crates of tea stacked on the quayside like small fortresses. Gulls circled overhead, and the air smelled of salt and tar and the sharp sweetness of spices being carried past in open sacks. Carts rattled over the cobblestones, and dock workers shouted to one another in a rhythm that sounded almost musical. The Crown Patent Office occupied a solid Georgian building on Queen Square, set back from the harbour noise behind a row of plane trees. It had tall sash windows, a polished black door with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, and the quiet authority of a place where important things happened slowly and on paper. A clerk in a dark coat met them in the entrance hall and led them upstairs to the registrar's chambers on the first floor. The room was large and orderly,
Shelves of bound ledgers running floor to ceiling, a partner's desk in the center stacked with sealed folders, and a portrait of the king hanging above the fireplace. The chief patent registrar was a man named Mr. Whitmore. He was perhaps 55, with spectacles perched low on his nose and the careful manner of someone who had spent his entire career weighing evidence. He rose when they entered and shook Victor's hand, then turned to Adelaide with a polite bow.
Mrs. Harding, Your Grace, please sit down. I received your letter last evening and cleared my morning schedule. You mentioned a matter of some urgency regarding a registered patent. Victor gestured for Adelaide to speak first. She appreciated that. This was her case, her husband's name. Victor understood that without being told. Adelaide placed 3 items on the desk: the leather-bound journal, the rolled linen blueprints, and the certified copy of the vestry logbook entry, complete with Reverend Aldridge's seal. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "my late husband, Thomas Harding, spent 3 years designing a mechanical loom he called the balanced tension loom. He completed the design in March of 1813. The journal before you contains his working notes, calculations, and dated entries spanning the full period of development. The blueprints are his original signed drawings, and the vestry document is a witnessed record from the parish of Oakhaven confirming the completion of the prototype." Whitmore reached for the journal and opened it with careful fingers. He turned the pages slowly, pausing at the detailed gear specifications and the hand-drawn diagrams. His expression remained neutral, but Adelaide noticed his eyebrows lift slightly at certain pages, the kind of involuntary reaction a man gives when he recognizes quality. "And the patent currently on file?" he asked, without looking up. "Registered in September of 1815 under the name Lord Marcus Harding," Victor said. "I have brought a copy of the filing for comparison." He placed a printed document beside the journal. "If you examine the specifications side by side, you will find they are identical in every respect, with one exception." Whitmore looked up. "What exception?" "A single gear ratio in the shuttle drive mechanism. The original design uses a 42:28 ratio. The patent filing lists 42:32. It is the only discrepancy in the entire document." "A copying error," Adelaide added, "made by someone who transcribed the numbers without understanding what they meant. My husband would never have made that mistake. The 28-tooth gear is essential to the shuttle timing. With a 32, the machine jams within minutes." Whitmore set down the journal and removed his spectacles. He polished them with a cloth from his desk drawer, a gesture Adelaide suspected he used when he needed a moment to think. "Mrs. Harding, I must be direct with you. What you are describing is a serious allegation. Patent theft carries significant legal consequences, including the forfeiture of all collected royalties and potential proceedings in the Court of Chancery." "I understand that." "And you are prepared to swear to the authenticity of these documents?" "Every page. I watched my husband write most of them." Whitmore replaced his spectacles and turned to Victor. "Your Grace, you mentioned in your letter that you attended a lecture by the late Mr. Harding at the Royal Institution. Can you provide testimony to that effect?" "I can. I have my personal notes from the lecture, dated November 1812, which describe the same mechanical principles found in both the journal and the patent filing. I am prepared to submit them as supporting evidence and to testify before any tribunal that Thomas Harding presented this work publicly months before his brother claimed ownership." Whitmore opened a ledger on his desk and began writing. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room for nearly a full minute. Adelaide sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, but kept her breathing even. Finally, Whitmore looked up. "I am satisfied that there are sufficient grounds to open a formal dispute record against the patent registered under Lord Marcus Harding's name. Under the authority of the Crown Patent Office, I am issuing a provisional injunction effective immediately." He pulled a pre-printed form from a drawer
and began filling it in with precise, deliberate strokes.
This injunction does three things. First, it suspends Lord Marcus Harding's right to collect any further factory royalties on the balanced tension loom design, effective from today. Second, it places a hold on the patent registration pending formal review. And third, it names Mrs. Adelaide Harding as the presumptive rights holder based on prior evidence of invention.
He signed the form, blotted it, and pressed the crown seal into a circle of dark red wax at the bottom of the page. Then he produced a second copy, signed and sealed it identically, and handed one to Adelaide and one to Victor.
The original will remain in our files. These copies carry full legal authority. Any attempt by Lord Marcus to collect royalties, license the design, or transfer the patent after today will be in direct violation of this order.
Adelaide took the document and held it. The paper was thick and stiff, the seal still warm under her thumb. She read the opening line.
By order of the Crown Patent Office, Bristol Branch, this injunction is hereby served against Lord Marcus Harding of Oakhaven, Wiltshire. Her husband's name appeared 4 times on the page, as inventor, as original designer, as the rightful owner, as the man whose work had been taken. Thomas's name, in official ink, under the Crown seal. Adelaide folded the document carefully and placed it inside her traveling case beside the journal.
"Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she said.
Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. Whitmore stood and offered his hand. "Mrs. Harding, in 20 years of serving in this office, I have seen a great many filings cross this desk. Your husband's design is among the finest mechanical specifications I have ever examined. It is an extraordinary piece of work. I am glad to help ensure it carries the correct name." They left the patent office and stepped into the midday Bristol sun. The harbour noise rushed back in. Gulls, carts, shouting dockhands, the creak of ship rigging. The world carried on as though nothing had changed. But something had changed. Adelaide carried a document in her case that could end Marcus's empire in a single reading. 2 days until the garden party. They returned to Bath as the evening light was turning the limestone buildings the color of warm honey. The city was quieter at this hour. The fashionable crowds had retreated from the pump room and the promenades, and the streets belonged to lamplighters making their rounds with long poles, and to servants hurrying home with baskets from the market. Victor's carriage stopped on Milsom Street, outside a narrow shop front with a painted sign reading Madame Delacroix, modiste and silk merchant. The windows were dressed with draped fabrics in deep jewel tones, emerald, ruby, amethyst, and a single finished gown stood on a wooden mannequin behind the glass, its cream silk catching the lamplight like water. Adelaide looked at the shop and then at Victor.
"Your Grace, I cannot accept."
"You can, and I would ask that you hear my reasoning before you refuse." Victor stepped down from the carriage and offered his hand. "Marcus invited you to his party with specific instructions to dress simply. He wants you to arrive looking like a charity case, so his guests can pity you and his daughters can feel superior. If you walk through those gates in a widow's mourning dress, every person there will see exactly what Marcus wants them to see. A poor relation who came to beg." Adelaide stayed where she was.
"I am not ashamed of my mourning dress."
"Nor should you be. But consider this. In 2 days, you are going to stand in front of Marcus's wealthiest investors and most prominent friends, while a legal decree is read aloud exposing him as a thief. Every eye in that garden will be on you. And when they look at you, they need to see a woman of authority. A woman who owns what she carries. A woman who belongs on the arm of a duke because she earned her place there through her own intelligence and courage." He paused. "The gown is not charity, Mrs. Harding. It is armor." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand and stepped down from the carriage.
Madame Delacroix was a small, brisk Frenchwoman with silver-streaked hair pinned beneath a lace cap and measuring tape draped permanently around her neck. She greeted Victor with the familiar warmth of a long-standing client and turned to Adelaide with an appraising eye that moved from her shoulders to her hem in a single practiced glance.
"Your Grace," she said to Victor, "you mentioned something special in your note."
"I did. Mrs. Harding requires a gown for an afternoon garden party. It must be finished within 2 days."
Madame Delacroix raised an eyebrow.
2 days is very little time, Your Grace.
"I understand. I am prepared to compensate you and your seamstresses generously for the urgency."
The modiste studied Adelaide again, this time more slowly. She walked a half-circle around her, noting the line of her shoulders, the way she held herself, the set of her jaw.
"You have good bones,"
Madame Delacroix said matter-of-factly.
"Strong carriage. You stand like a woman who is used to working, which means you stand straight. That is better than half the ladies who come through my door, slouching under the weight of their own boredom."
She turned to a rack of fabric bolts along the back wall.
"What color were you thinking?"
Victor looked at Adelaide. "Your choice?" Adelaide walked along the rack, running her fingers across the fabrics. Ivory damask, pale rose taffeta, dove-gray muslin. All perfectly respectable, all perfectly forgettable. Then her hand stopped on a bolt of sapphire velvet. It was deep and rich, the color of a winter sky just after sunset, dark enough to carry weight, bright enough to command attention. She pulled the edge of the fabric toward the lamplight and watched the color shift.
"This one,"
she said.
Madame Delacroix smiled.
"Excellent taste, madame. That velvet came from a merchant in Lyon. I have been saving it for someone who would do it justice." For the next hour, the shop became a workshop. Madame Delacroix took Adelaide's measurements with quiet efficiency while discussing the construction. The gown would be high-waisted in the current fashion, with a fitted bodice, a square neckline, and full-length sleeves that gathered slightly at the wrist. The skirt would fall in a clean line without excessive volume, elegant, structured, and designed for a woman who needed to move through a crowd with purpose. "Silver embroidery along the bodice and hem," Madame Delacroix said, pinning a muslin pattern against Adelaide's frame. "Small motifs, tasteful, enough to catch the light without overwhelming the fabric."
"What motifs?"
Adelaide asked. The modiste paused, her pins held between her lips. She looked at Adelaide with curiosity.
"What would you like, madame? Flowers? Stars? A geometric border?"
Adelaide thought for a moment. "Gears." Madame Delacroix removed the pins from her mouth.
"I beg your pardon?"
"Small interlocking gears, like the mechanisms inside a clock. My husband was a mechanical engineer, and his work is the reason I will be wearing this gown. I would like his work to be part of it." The modiste glanced at Victor, who was leaning against the counter with his arms folded. He gave the smallest nod, and the trace of something Adelaide thought might be admiration. Madame Delacroix turned back to Adelaide. "Gears it is, silver thread on sapphire velvet. It will be unusual, madame, I will tell you that."
"Good," Adelaide said. "I have had quite enough of being usual."
While Adelaide stood for the final fitting of the muslin pattern, Victor excused himself to the front of the shop. Through the workroom doorway, Adelaide could see him speaking quietly with Madame Delacroix's assistant, a young woman arranging ribbons in a glass case. He handed her a folded note and a coin, and the assistant slipped out the shop door into the evening street. When he returned, Adelaide raised an eyebrow.
"Sending messages, Your Grace?"
"Arrangements," he said simply. "There are still a few pieces to put in place before the party."
"You are being deliberately mysterious."
"I am being efficient. There is a difference." Adelaide almost laughed. She caught herself and looked away, but the corner of her mouth stayed turned upward. It struck her that she had not come close to laughing in a very long time. Grief had a way of making laughter feel disloyal, as though enjoying a single moment meant forgetting the person you had lost.
But standing in a modiste shop in a pinned muslin pattern, discussing silver gear embroidery with a French dressmaker, while a duke made secretive arrangements in the next room, the absurdity of it found a crack in her armor and slipped through. Thomas would have laughed. She was certain of it. He would have sat in the corner of this shop with his journal on his knee, sketching the gear motifs himself and arguing with Madame Delacroix about the tooth count on each embroidered wheel. He would have loved every second of this strange, improbable plan. Madame Delacroix finished her pinning and stepped back. "I will have the gown ready by the morning of the 6th. My girls will work through tomorrow night. It will be beautiful, madame. I promise you that." Adelaide looked at her reflection in the tall mirror beside the fitting platform. The muslin pattern was shapeless and pinned at odd angles, nothing like the finished gown it would become.
But underneath it, she could see herself clearly for the first time in 2 years. She looked like a woman with a plan. Marcus Harding was not a stupid man. Careless, yes. Greedy, certainly. But stupid was something he had never been. And it was his lack of stupidity that made him dangerous when he felt threatened. He had received word that morning from his new housekeeper that Adelaide had visited the estate the previous day. The housekeeper described it as a brief, unremarkable call. The widow had returned some handkerchiefs and left within the hour. She had wandered upstairs briefly looking for the retiring room, but otherwise caused no disturbance. Marcus should have dismissed it. A widow returning embroidered handkerchiefs was hardly an event worth noting. But something about the timing nagged at him. Adelaide had not visited Harding Park in over a year. She had not written, not called, not made any effort to maintain ties with his side of the family.
And now, 3 days before the garden party she had been invited to attend as a prop for his daughter's social display, she had appeared at his front door with a gift and a smile. Marcus did not trust smiles from people he had wronged. He had wronged enough people to know that smiles from them usually meant trouble. By noon, he had convinced himself that Adelaide was planning to make some kind of scene at the party. Perhaps she would arrive in exaggerated mourning to embarrass him. Perhaps she would corner his investors with tearful stories about her poverty. Perhaps she would simply stand in the middle of his beautiful garden and announced to everyone that her brother-in-law had left her destitute while he grew rich. He could not allow any of it. The garden party was his centerpiece, the event where he planned to announce a new licensing agreement for the loom patent with 2 northern mill owners. The contracts were drafted. The investors were arriving tomorrow. Everything depended on the appearance of legitimacy, respectability, and control. So Marcus did what Marcus always did when he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He went on the offensive. That afternoon, he dressed in his finest afternoon coat, took his carriage into the nearby market town, and made the rounds at the assembly rooms. The assembly rooms were the social heart of the county gentry. Every family of standing passed through those doors at least twice a week, for card evenings, subscription dances, or simply to sit in the tea room and exchange information that they called conversation and everyone else called gossip. Marcus knew the currency of these rooms intimately. A well-placed word here was worth more than 100 letters. He began with Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of a retired colonel and the most efficient gossip distributor in the county. He found her in the card room, resting between hands of whist, and sat down beside her with an expression of practiced concern. "I am worried about my sister-in-law,"
he said, lowering his voice just enough to ensure she leaned in.
"Poor Adelaide. Since Thomas's passing, she has become quite fragile. I have done everything I can to support her, settled her debts, arranged her pension, invited her to family occasions. But I fear she has grown increasingly unstable. She visited my estate yesterday, making the most peculiar claims, talking about Thomas's old tinkering projects as though they were works of great importance. I am afraid grief has clouded her judgment."
Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened with precisely the mixture of sympathy and appetite that Marcus had expected. "How dreadful! The poor woman!"
"I mention it only because she may attend the garden party tomorrow, and I would hate for anyone to be alarmed by her behavior. She means well, of course. She simply does not always make sense these days."
From Mrs. Pemberton, Marcus moved to Sir Harold Flint, a magistrate who valued order above all else.
He told Sir Harold that Adelaide had been sending confused letters to various officers in Bristol, making claims about Thomas's old inventions. He told Lady Ashby, the wife of a prominent landowner, that Adelaide had taken to wandering the countryside in a state of distress. He told each person a slightly different version of the same story, all carrying the same conclusion. Adelaide Harding had lost her grip on reality, and anything she said at the party should be treated with gentle pity rather than serious attention. By the time Marcus left the assembly rooms at 4 o'clock, he was satisfied that he had built a wall of doubt around Adelaide thick enough to withstand whatever scene she might attempt. He climbed into his carriage and directed his driver home. As the horses turned onto the main promenade that ran along the river, Marcus glanced idly out the window. Then he stopped breathing. Walking along the promenade in full view of every person taking their afternoon stroll was Adelaide Harding. She was dressed simply, her usual grey wool, but she was walking with her hand resting on the arm of a man whose face Marcus recognized immediately. Every landowner, industrialist and merchant in the west of England knew that face. Duke Victor of Ravenhurst. They were walking slowly, at an easy pace, as though they had nowhere particular to be and all the time in the world. Victor was speaking to Adelaide with his head inclined slightly toward hers, and Adelaide was listening with the calm, attentive expression of a woman entirely in command of herself. There was nothing frantic about her, nothing confused, nothing remotely resembling the unhinged widow Marcus had just spent 2 hours describing to half the county. Other walkers on the promenade were noticing. Mrs. Pemberton herself was standing near the bandstand with her husband, her mouth slightly open, watching Adelaide pass by on a duke's arm. Sir Harold Flint was seated on a bench reading a newspaper, and he lowered it to stare as the pair walked past. Lady Ashby, emerging from a milliner's shop with a hat box under her arm, stopped dead on the pavement. Marcus watched from his carriage window as every carefully planted seed of doubt he had sown that afternoon withered and died in the space of a single promenade walk. A woman on the arm of Duke Victor of Ravenhurst was not a woman anyone would call unstable. A woman walking publicly beside one of the wealthiest and most respected peers in the region was not a woman anyone would dismiss as confused. Marcus did not know how Adelaide had come to know the Duke. He did not know what she had told him, or what they were planning. But he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has spent his life manipulating appearances, that the appearance walking toward him along the river was one he could not manipulate. He pulled the carriage curtain shut and told his driver to take the long way home. On the promenade, Adelaide saw the Harding carriage turn sharply at the corner and disappear down a side street. She did not comment on it. She did not need to. Victor had seen it too. "He knows something has changed," Victor said. "Let him wonder," Adelaide replied. "Wondering is worse than knowing. It gives a man nowhere to stand." They continued walking until the promenade emptied and the lamplighters came out. Adelaide's hand stayed on Victor's arm, steady and sure. Tomorrow was the garden party. Tomorrow, Marcus would stop wondering and start understanding. One more day. The morning of the garden party began with rain. Adelaide stood at the window of the guest room Victor had arranged for her at a respectable lodging house on Great Pulteney Street, watching the grey clouds roll across the Bath skyline. The rain was light, more mist than downpour, and the kind that usually cleared by midday. But there was something fitting about waking to grey skies on a day like this. Sunshine would have felt too easy. too generous for what lay ahead. She dressed in her usual grey wool for now. The sapphire gown hung behind the wardrobe door in a linen garment cover, delivered by Madame Delacroix's assistant at first light. Adelaide had opened the cover just once, run her fingers along the velvet bodice, and traced the tiny silver gear motifs embroidered along the neckline. Then she had closed it again. There would be time for that later. At 9 o'clock, a message arrived from Victor. 2 words in his firm, slanted handwriting. Come now.
Adelaide gathered her traveling case, the one containing Thomas's journal, the blueprints, the vestry document, and the Crown injunction, and walked through the damp streets to Victor's town residence on the Royal Crescent. The house was tall, pale stone, with black iron railings and a wide front door attended by a liveried footman who showed her through to the library without a word. The library was a handsome room lined with mahogany shelves and filled with leather-bound volumes, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested someone actually read them. A fire had been lit in the grate despite the season, and the warmth was welcome against the damp morning air. French doors opened onto a small walled garden where raindrops hung from rose stems like glass beads. Victor was standing by the fireplace. He was not alone. Seated in a wing-back chair beside the desk was a broad-shouldered man in a dark blue coat with brass buttons and a high collar. He had a square jaw, thick grey sideburns, and the bearing of someone accustomed to entering rooms and having people straighten their posture. A leather document case rested across his knees.
"Mrs. Harding," Victor said, "may I introduce Mr. Edward Cartwright, the High Sheriff of Wiltshire." The sheriff rose and bowed. His handshake was firm and brief. "Mrs. Harding, I have heard a great deal about your situation this morning. Please sit down." Adelaide took the chair opposite him. Victor remained standing by the mantel, his hands behind his back. She noticed he had positioned himself slightly off to the side, close enough to support her, far enough to make clear this was her matter, and he was present as a witness, not a handler. She was grateful for that.
"Mr. Cartwright," Adelaide began, "I assume His Grace has explained the circumstances."
"He has given me a summary. I should like to hear the rest from you directly, and then I will need to examine the documents." Adelaide told the story from the beginning. She spoke clearly and without embellishment. Thomas's 3 years of work, his death, Marcus's removal of the papers from her cottage, the stolen patent filing, the vestry record, the journal recovered from Marcus's attic, the injunction issued in Bristol. She laid each fact down in order, the way Thomas might have laid out the components of a machine, each piece connecting to the next with logical precision. The sheriff listened without interrupting. When she finished, he opened his document case and held out his hand. "The injunction, please." Adelaide handed him the sealed Crown Patent Office document. Cartwright unfolded it and read it slowly, line by line.
He examined the Crown seal, tilting it toward the firelight to verify the impression. He checked the registrar's signature against a reference he carried in his own case, a printed list of authorized Crown officers and their authenticated marks. Then he set the injunction on the desk and read it a second time. "This is a properly issued Crown order," he said. "The seal is authentic. The registrar's signature matches the current office holder. The injunction is legally binding from the date of issue, which was 2 days ago."
"Will you enforce it?"
Adelaide asked. Cartwright looked at her over the top of the document. "That depends, Mrs. Harding, on what you are asking me to do."
"I am asking you to accompany us to Lord Marcus Harding's garden party this afternoon and serve the injunction publicly in front of his guests. Lord Marcus is planning to announce a new licensing agreement for the loom patent at the party. If that agreement is signed while a Crown injunction is in effect, both Lord Marcus and the mill owners involved will be in direct violation of a legal order. I want to prevent that from happening."
The sheriff was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands across the document case on his knees.
Mrs. Harding serving a crown order at a social gathering is unusual. The standard procedure would be to deliver it by letter or to arrange a formal meeting at Lord Marcus's residence.
With respect, Mr. Cartwright, Lord Marcus has already demonstrated what he does when he receives information he finds inconvenient. He dismissed a loyal servant of 23 years for asking a single honest question. He attempted to have my husband's original papers destroyed. He spent yesterday afternoon spreading false rumors about my mental state to inoculate himself against anything I might say. Adelaide kept her voice level. If I serve this injunction privately, Marcus will find a way to delay, dispute, or discard it before anyone else sees it. The only way to ensure compliance is to serve it in the presence of the very people whose investments depend on the patent being legitimate. Cartwright studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it.
Your Grace, he said, turning to Victor, do you support this approach?
Completely, and I will stand as witness to the service of the order. The sheriff nodded slowly. He placed the injunction back on the desk and squared its edges with his thumbs. Very well. I will accompany you to the garden party and serve the decree in the presence of Lord Marcus's guests. If he resists or attempts to obstruct the order, I have the authority to compel compliance on the spot. He looked at Adelaide. You understand that once this is done publicly, there is no walking it back. Lord Marcus's reputation, his financial arrangements, his standing in the county, everything changes the moment I read that document aloud. I understand. And you are certain this is what you want? Adelaide thought of Thomas's journal pressed against her ribs in a dusty attic. She thought of 23 years of Mr. Phelps's service erased in an hour.
She thought of Marcus's letter asking her to dress simply so his daughters could shine.
Mr. Cartwright, my husband invented something remarkable, and his own brother buried his name to profit from it. What I want is for Thomas to be remembered for what he built. Everything else that happens today is simply the cost of getting there.
The sheriff picked up his hat from the side table and tucked the document case under his arm. Then I will meet you at the gates of Harding Park at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I suggest you do not be late. These things are best done before the champagne runs out and the guests begin leaving. He shook Adelaide's hand once more, bowed to Victor, and left through the front door. Through the library window, Adelaide watched his carriage pull away down the crescent, its wheels leaving dark tracks on the wet stone. Victor moved to the desk and straightened the remaining papers. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Adelaide looked at the sapphire gown hanging in its cover by the door, where Victor's footman had brought it from her lodgings that morning. She looked at the traveling case beside her chair, heavy with evidence. She looked at the empty wingback where the sheriff had sat. Like a woman who has a great deal to do before 4 o'clock, she said, and stood. Lord Marcus Harding's garden party was everything he had designed it to be, a spectacle of wealth displayed with just enough taste to pass for modesty. The manor lawns had been transformed. A large, open-sided pavilion of white canvas stretched across the south terrace, its poles wound with garlands of ivy and white roses. Beneath it, long tables draped in linen held trays of cold meats, poached salmon, fruit towers, and iced confections shaped like swans. Liveried footmen moved between the guests carrying silver trays of champagne and lemonade. A string quartet played from a raised platform beside the ornamental pond, their music drifting across the garden like perfume. The guests numbered perhaps 80. County families in their finest afternoon dress mingled with Marcus's business associates, mill owners from Lancashire and Yorkshire in well-cut coats that carried the faint authority of new money. Their wives clustered in groups, examining the gardens and each other's jewelry with equal interest. Marcus's 2 daughters, Louisa and Charlotte, circulated in matching pink silk gowns that rustled with every step, accepting compliments the way flowers accept sunlight, as though it was simply their due.
Marcus himself stood at the center of the pavilion, holding court beside a large easel draped in green cloth. He wore a burgundy coat with gold buttons and an embroidered waistcoat that must have cost more than Adelaide's annual pension. His smile was wide and generous. His voice carried across the lawn in confident waves. He was a man at the peak of his performance, and he knew every line. At 3:30, Marcus tapped a crystal glass with a silver knife and called his guests to the pavilion.
"Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends," he began, his voice warm with rehearsed sincerity. "I have gathered you here today for a celebration. As many of you know, the Harding name has long been associated with industry, innovation, and progress. Today, I am delighted to announce the next chapter in that legacy."
He pulled the green cloth from the easel. Beneath it was a large printed diagram of the balanced tension loom, Thomas's design, rendered in fine detail with the words, "The Harding Mechanical Loom, patent holder Lord Marcus Harding," printed in bold letters across the top.
"This machine," Marcus continued, placing his hand on the diagram, "is my proudest achievement. 3 years of personal research and development have produced a loom that will transform the cotton industry. And I am pleased to announce that as of this afternoon, I have signed exclusive licensing agreements with 2 of the finest mill operations in the North, Mr. Garrett of Leeds and Mr. Whitfield of Manchester, bringing the Harding loom to full-scale production." Applause rippled through the pavilion. Garrett and Whitfield, 2 stout men standing near the front, nodded with satisfaction. Marcus beamed. "I must also take a moment," Marcus added, lowering his voice to a register he reserved for performances of humility, "to remember my late brother, Thomas. Thomas was a kind soul, if somewhat impractical. He dabbled in mechanical tinkering from time to time, and I like to think his early curiosity planted the seed that grew into this invention. Though, of course, the final design, the engineering, and the patent are entirely my own work." A murmur of polite sympathy passed through the crowd. A few guests shook their heads gently at the mention of the deceased brother. Marcus allowed the moment to settle, then raised his glass. "To progress," he said. "To progress," the crowd echoed. Marcus drank. His smile widened. The string quartet resumed playing. Everything was going exactly as planned. Then someone near the garden gate said, "Good Lord!" The voice was quiet, but it carried the particular weight of genuine surprise, the kind that makes other people turn to see what caused it. And they turned. One by one, then in clusters, then all at once, 80 guests rotated toward the front gate of Harding Park. A carriage had arrived. It was black and immaculate, drawn by a matched pair of gray horses with polished brass fittings on their harness. The door bore a gilded crest that anyone in the west of England would recognize, the shield and laurels of the Ravenhurst dukedom. A footman in full livery stepped down and opened the carriage door. Duke Victor of Ravenhurst emerged first. He wore a dark charcoal coat, perfectly tailored, with a silver waistcoat and a cravat pinned with a small sapphire. He descended the carriage step, turned, and offered his hand upward. Adelaide took it and stepped down onto the gravel drive. The sapphire velvet gown moved like water in the late afternoon light. The silver gear embroidery along the bodice and hem caught the sun and threw tiny points of light across the fabric, as though the dress itself were alive with the mechanics of Thomas's invention, stitched into every thread. Her hair was pinned simply, swept up with a silver comb. She wore no other jewelry. She did not need any. She placed her hand on Victor's arm, and together they walked through the garden gate onto the manor lawn. The string quartet faltered. The first violinist missed a note, recovered, and then stopped playing altogether when the cellist set down his bow to stare. The quartet fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips.
80 pairs of eyes fixed on the woman in sapphire walking steadily across the grass toward the pavilion. Mrs. Pemberton, standing near the refreshment table with a plate of cold salmon, opened her mouth and forgot to close it.
Sir Harold Flint set down his glass on the nearest surface, which happened to be someone else's hat. Lady Ashby gripped her husband's arm so tightly he winced. Marcus saw her last. He had been turned toward his investors, discussing delivery schedules, when the silence reached him. The absence of noise, of music, of chatter, of laughter, pressed against his ears like a hand. He turned slowly. Adelaide was 20 paces from the pavilion, walking toward him with her chin raised and her gaze level. She looked nothing like the woman he had invited to humiliate. She looked nothing like the widow he had described as unhinged at the assembly rooms. She looked like a woman who had come to collect a debt and who had brought the means to collect it. Behind her, a second carriage had pulled through the gate. From it stepped a broad-shouldered man in a dark blue coat with brass buttons, the High Sheriff of Wiltshire, carrying a leather document case under his arm. Marcus's smile did not fall. It froze. It stayed fixed on his face like something painted on, and behind it, for the first time in 6 days, Lord Marcus Harding felt the ground shift beneath his polished boots. Adelaide stopped at the edge of the pavilion. The guests parted for her without being asked, opening a path between her and Marcus as naturally as a river divides around a stone. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Duke Victor stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," Duke Victor said. His voice was calm, measured, and carried the particular clarity of a man who did not need to raise it to be heard. The pavilion had gone so silent that the rustle of ivy against the canvas poles sounded loud. "I apologize for interrupting Lord Marcus's celebration. I assure you this will not take long." Marcus stepped forward from behind the easel. His frozen smile had thawed into something harder. "Victor, what a pleasant surprise. I was not aware you had been invited." "I was not. I am here on a matter of public record, and I believe your guests have a right to hear it before any further business agreements are signed today." Marcus glanced at Garrett and Whitfield, his 2 mill investors, who were watching the scene with the cautious stillness of men who had not become wealthy by ignoring trouble. He turned back to Victor with a short laugh that landed flat in the quiet garden. "My dear Duke, whatever this is about, I am sure it can wait until after the party. We are in the middle of a celebration, and I would hate to bore my guests with—" "You will want to hear this now, Lord Marcus," the High Sheriff said from behind Adelaide. His voice had a different quality from Victor's, heavier, blunter, carrying the weight of an office that did not make suggestions. "I strongly advise you not to leave this pavilion until I have finished." Marcus looked at the sheriff, then at Adelaide, then at the document case under the sheriff's arm. Something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, like a man who hears a sound in the dark and knows exactly what made it, but hopes he is wrong. Victor reached into his coat and produced the sealed Crown Patent Office document. He unfolded it, held it at arm's length so that Marcus could see the red wax seal at the bottom, and began to read. "By order of the Crown Patent Office, Bristol Branch, this injunction is hereby served against Lord Marcus Harding of Oakhaven, Wiltshire, regarding patent registration number 4471, filed September the 15th, 1815, for a mechanical device designated the Balanced Tension Loom." The garden was perfectly still. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Following examination of evidence presented by Mrs. Adelaide Harding, widow of the late Mr. Thomas Harding of Bath, and corroborated by the industrial testimony of His Grace the Duke of Ravenhurst, the Crown Patent Office finds sufficient grounds to determine that the aforementioned patent was filed fraudulently. A murmur passed through the crowd like a wave through standing water. Garrett and Whitfield exchanged a glance.
Marcus's daughters stopped moving entirely, their pink silk frozen mid-rustle. Victor continued reading. The original design, calculations, and working specifications for the balanced tension loom were created solely by Mr. Thomas Harding over a period of 3 years, concluding in March of 1813. This completion is verified by a witnessed parish record, a personal journal bearing dated entries in Mr. Thomas Harding's hand, and signed original blueprints recovered from Lord Marcus Harding's private estate. Marcus opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it again. The Crown Patent Office hereby revokes Lord Marcus Harding's registration of the balanced tension loom. All rights, royalties, and licensing income derived from this patent are transferred immediately and in full to Mrs. Adelaide Harding as the lawful heir of the inventor. Any licensing agreements signed under the fraudulent registration are void. Lord Marcus Harding is further ordered to surrender all collected royalties to date, which shall be calculated and enforced by the Crown's appointed assessors. Victor folded the document and handed it to the sheriff, who stepped forward and placed it directly into Marcus's hands. Marcus took it reflexively, the way a man catches something thrown at him before he realizes what it is.
Lord Marcus Harding, the sheriff said formally, you have been served. This order is effective immediately. Any attempt to collect further royalties, license the design, or transfer the patent will constitute a violation of a Crown decree and will be prosecuted accordingly. The silence that followed was absolute. 80 guests stood in a garden pavilion decorated for a triumph and watched it become a reckoning. The loom diagram still sat on the easel behind Marcus, the words, patent holder, Lord Marcus Harding, printed across the top in letters that now read like a confession. Marcus looked down at the document in his hands. His fingers were white around the edges of the paper. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its warmth, all its rehearsed charm, all its careful performance. "This is absurd," he said. "Thomas was a dreamer. He tinkered, he sketched. He never finished anything in his life. That loom is my work, my investment, my—" "Your investment," Adelaide said. It was the first time she had spoken since arriving. Every head turned toward her.
"You are right about one thing, Marcus. You did invest money. You gave Thomas £60 toward materials in the autumn of 1811. He recorded it in his journal, which I have here." She touched the traveling case at her side. "He also recorded that you told him the money was a gift between brothers. There was no contract, no partnership agreement, no shared ownership. You gave him £60 and in return, after he died, you took his life's work, erased his name, and built yourself a fortune." She looked around the pavilion, at the guests in their fine clothes, at the tables of food, at the garlands and the silver trays and the champagne glasses catching the last of the afternoon sun.
Everything you see here was paid for by a dead man's brilliance. Every new room in this house, every silk gown on your daughters' backs, every bottle of champagne on that table. All of it was bought with money that belonged to Thomas, and through Thomas, to me. Marcus stared at her. His jaw worked, but no words came. The document hung limp in his hand. Garrett cleared his throat. "Lord Marcus, I believe we will need to review our agreement in light of this information." Beside him, Whitfield nodded curtly and stepped back from the easel as though it had grown hot. Mrs. Pemberton, who just yesterday had absorbed Marcus's whispered stories about Adelaide's fragile mind, turned to Lady Ashby and said, loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, "Well, she certainly does not seem unhinged to me." A ripple of murmured agreement moved through the crowd. The tide had turned, and it had turned completely. Adelaide looked at Marcus one last time. She did not gloat. She did not smile in victory. She simply held his gaze with the steady calm of a woman who had walked through grief, poverty, and betrayal, and come out the other side holding the truth in her hands.
"Thomas deserved better from you," she said quietly. "He loved you. He trusted you. And you buried him twice, once in the ground and once under your own name. I came here today to dig him out."
She turned away from Marcus and walked back through the parted crowd toward the garden gate. Victor fell into step beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. The sheriff followed at a respectful distance, his duty discharged. The string quartet, unsure what else to do, began playing again, something soft and slow that drifted across the lawn as the evening light turned everything gold. At the gate, Adelaide paused. She looked back once, at the pavilion, at the guests, at the easel still standing with Thomas's loom design displayed for all to see. His design. His name. Restored. Victor opened the carriage door and offered his hand. Adelaide took it and stepped up into the carriage. She settled against the seat and placed her traveling case on her lap. The case that held a journal, a set of blueprints, a parish record, and a crown decree. Everything Thomas had built, carried home at last. "Where to, Mrs. Harding?" Victor asked from the seat across from her. Adelaide looked at him, this man who had knocked on a stranger's door because he believed the right name should be on the right invention. This man who had called a gown armor and meant it. This man who had stood beside her for 6 days while she rebuilt something Marcus had tried to erase. "Home," she said. "Take me home." The carriage pulled away from Harding Park as the sun set behind the Wiltshire hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Adelaide rested her hand on the traveling case and closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she did not dream of what she had lost. She thought instead of what she had found.